Hello, and welcome to this week's book club for Star Wars Most Wanted by Rae Carson. We're in the back chunk of the book now. Everything's kind of coming to the surface. Today we are discussing chapters 15 and 16. If you're not familiar with this series, we're basically going through the book 2 chapters at a time to talk about the deeper themes and happenings that are going on. And this is something I've done for a couple of Star Wars books now, and it's been a lot of fun. But with that, we're going to get into chapter 15, where we last left Han, Qi'ra, Sulo. They had just rescued the Wookiee from the Imperial building, and they're trying to get away. So where we find them here is they're exiting the building. They are walking out, hoping no one finds them. They're doing the just don't look suspicious and you'll be fine thing. Then an alarm goes off, and so it's just kind of like this increasing point of tension throughout. They get into the speeder and they find out that they're being followed. Han pulls a really good move to like bank so that they can see if they're being followed or not. It's just an increasing point of tension up until the end of the chapter where they're in a full-blown chase and they're getting shot at and everything is just escalated. Before we get to that point, we meet Qi'ra on the other side of having just done this operation, where she has gone in, gone undercover, done everything she's supposed to be doing, and she's beating herself up. She is mad at herself, largely for the double dose of gas to the Wookiee, which she thinks she made a massive miscalculation on. She's upset that she didn't think of a backup plan for if there was no map in the lobby. She's upset with herself for letting the jerk in the elevator get under her skin. And she's basically going through every twist and turn in the plan and beating herself up for not just being magically better, even though it's not like she's ever done something like this before. Again, this is something about Qi'ra that I think makes her very relatable, even though her circumstances are certainly beyond anything that many of us might have gone through. Personally, I'm that type of person where if something has gone 75%, 80% of what I wanted it to, man, am I going to be mad at myself for that 20, 25% that I didn't account for. That's something that's very much part of my personality. It's much easier. Like, I think part of it is just that control aspect. I think part of it is like that perfectionist aspect. I'm not necessarily a perfectionist, but I do expect and demand a lot out of myself, and that's something I can relate to. But I think it's also a control thing to the degree that if it's Kira's fault or if it's my fault or whoever is blaming themselves' fault, then that's a control thing, right? If I mess it up, then yes, I'm putting that guilt on myself, but that also is a way for me to understand the universe, right? I messed it up. Even though it can feel bad to put all that guilt on yourself, it can feel a relief to think that you had control. That what happened was not that you are out of control. What happened is not that there are things beyond which you could do. It's simply that you didn't do it, that you failed. And it can be easier to think yourself a failure than to think yourself incapable of failure or success because things are out of your hands, which is not healthy. It's not a healthy thing to do at all, but it's a very natural human thing to do, especially if you are the type of person who likes to be in control, like Qi'ra. So it's a brief moment, but it's an important moment for her, especially somebody who's at her age in general, much less everything she's gone through, not really learning the kind of healthy thought habits to not do that to yourself. So that was a point, again, I've said in almost every video every week that I find that I can connect to Qi'ra quite a bit, and that was just another way that I could do so. Now, another part of Qi'ra, and this is not necessarily something I connect to, but is very integral to her character, is she's realizing how they basically were able to do this because of the engineers' connections and resources, and Qi'ra realizes that this is what she wants. And it's always interesting to me that Qi'ra is never really talking about power. She doesn't really want power to control or manipulate people because she doesn't get off on that. But she wants to have control, and she wants to not be controlled, right? For her, it's not just a greed to need things here, but it's also a protection. If she has control, that means somebody else doesn't. And so she wants the connections and the resources and the wealth, not because she's greedy, but because it's what she feels like she needs to maintain control or put things into control or make things better. And so she's really starting to idolize all of these things that the engineer is able to do and is able to bring to them. She does note that she and Han make a really good team, that she is really good at planning, but at every point where her plan didn't really work out, Han was able to adapt to that. And that's absolutely true. They play off of each other really well. Each other's strengths is the other's weakness, and it all intersects. And it's nice, again, seeing them go from this maybe rivals thing to a point of, hey, we can work together, we can be on the same team, we can accomplish a goal. Another thing Qi'ra realizes is just how good at piloting Han is. I do appreciate in these chapters where we do learn a lot about Han from Qi'ra's perspective and Qi'ra from Han's perspective, how times in these chapters take a moment to address what the other person is doing or going through. It might not be as trustworthy is not the right word, but like obviously if you're learning about the character from the character, you know it's not being put through a lens that skews it. So it might not be as objective, but I think it's good to be able to learn about a character, but also learn about a character from this other character, so you learn how that other character feels about the first character, but then you're also learning about that other character and how they see the first character. So it's a little bit complicated, but I like how that plays out. And here we're seeing that Qi'ra understands that Han really belongs behind the wheel, or behind the starship joystick thing, behind the controls, and how much of a natural he is at navigating this kind of chase scene, having never really had the opportunity to drive too much before the events of this book. Now, they do run, they are on the run, they are curving through all of the city streets and everything, but one of the most telling parts of the chase is after they get away, they get to this kind of more slum portion of Corellia, and they have to go through a toll booth, and on the other side of the toll booth is the ritzy part of Corellia. It's a very intense version of the other side of the tracks, if you've ever heard that phrase. This idea of you literally have to pay to go through a wall, and when you do, you go to the nice part of town. And it is another example of the disparity and the kind of class differences that you have on Corellia. You know, what Han and Qi'ra and Sulo are not used to. Sulo maybe a little bit more because he comes from Coruscant, but they're kind of seeing this other part of their planet for the first time. Once they go through the gate, however, that means they're going to be noticed because they've gone through the gate. Ship comes up on them, starts firing on them, they're trying to get away. It's stressful because the Wookiee's also waking up, and they really don't want like a half-drugged, disoriented Wookiee freaking out in their back seat. They get up to where they're supposed to meet the tower, and this is an important point because Han's asking Qi'ra what they should do, and Qi'ra reaches a point where she admits, I don't know what to do, I don't have a plan. What do your instincts say? You know, we've gone, I said this last week too, where we went from Qi'ra being annoyed by Han's instincts to a point where she was starting to trust and appreciate them. And then in this chapter, she vocalizes that. Like, we've known that she's been thinking that she's more appreciative of it. But this is her taking a moment to say, no, Han, I'm going to trust you and trust your instincts. What should we do? And then Han continues with the plan, and it's a good moment between them. I also like Qi'ra noting that Han has this smile that she's starting to like. So you're starting to see things bloom between the two of them. Corellian security is still after them. They see a shuttle. They think it's a shuttle who's coming to pick them up. They want to hide behind the speeder, but now the speeder's leaking fuel, so they have to get away from the speeder. The shuttle shows up in the nick of time. They load up. They fly away, and the last thing they see on the surface of Corellia is the speeder blowing up. And this is a big deal because the speeder they've been in this whole time is still Sulo's brother's speeder. This is still the speeder that was purchased with all of Sulo's cut of the inheritance, his family's inheritance. So not only was it an affront that that speeder existed in the first place, but now there's this other affront of, well, it's all they had and now they literally have nothing, because in the process of Sulo helping out Han and Qi'ra in a thing that he didn't really need to help in, everything that his brother owns is gone, and you know, there's some interesting family dynamics there, and so it's an important moment, but it's not one that we get a lot of time to appreciate, because then we move on to chapter 16. They are leaving Corellia. Everyone is a little bit distraught, or a lot of it distraught, at the destruction of the speeder, but now we're in Han's perspective, and this is such a cool thing to get to read, because we're reading Han Solo going to space for the first time, and Han Solo seeing hyperspace for the first time, and how he marvels at it, and he gets to go to space, and what I love is his first trip to hyperspace makes him nauseous. I love that idea. that this is where he belongs, but he still gets a little bit space sick. And I think that's a good way of saying, like, here's this great moment, here's this great hero, but he's this human being too who's going to feel a little bit topsy-turvy. Because I'm sure if you've never been in space ever, and you're in young adulthood and you go for the first time, your body's just going to be like, what the heck is going on? So I thought that was a cool detail to add. In space, they're jumping away, they're getting away from the people who are chasing them. They find out the Wookiee that they picked up is a pilot, which is an interesting thing I'm going to point out a little bit later in this chapter. And the guy who is piloting is kind of, you know, he brags a little bit about being a good pilot, even though he acknowledges how the Wookiee is a better pilot, and he's explaining the tricks of like short hyperspace jumps, and they're saying how they get closer to these asteroids, and they see the pleasure cruiser. And I like Han's reaction to it, where he likes it because it's a ship, and seeing a ship is cool, but he really thinks it's a bit ostentatious. You know, he's like, why would you need this big viewing deck? What's the point of just looking in space when you could be looking at space from behind the controls? He describes it as a form over function kind of a ship, but Qi'ra is completely mesmerized. Like, this type of ship is exactly what Qi'ra is into, because it represents the type of things that she wants. It represents wealth and resources and connections, because you wouldn't have a ship like that unless you had people in your life that would go onto that ship. So we're seeing the differences in how Han and Qi'ra view things in the galaxy. They land, the Wookiee is reunited with his friends, and there's a nice moment. They are described as servants, which is another thing that I'll add into something I'll say here in a little bit. But then they go into this really big viewing room where it's just them and the engineer, and they finally get to meet her. Now, they're all nervous because they don't actually know if this engineer is going to be a good person or not. They know she's a former Imperial, so she might be bad news. She's just maybe not as bad as your regular Imperial. That doesn't necessarily make her a good person. The space she's in is beautiful. She is described very beautifully, and they're having these interactions. One thing that Han points out that she gets a little bit nervous, or that makes him a little bit nervous, is she describes the Wookiee as an asset. Now, this kind of goes along with the people that they meet in the hangar are servants, which I found kind of odd. But we're also told that the Wookiee is a pilot, and would the Imperials like want Wookiee slaves who are pilots, because they're usually slave labor. And so I think it's meant to be a little bit vague. You're supposed to be wondering if this person's going to end up being a good person or not, because an asset could be a way to humanize isn't the right word, but desentientize, unpersonify, I don't know what I'm looking to say there, but a way to make a Wookiee not a person by calling him an asset. But an asset is also what you would call a spy or an operative or a critical part of your organization. So it's an interesting choice of words, and up until now we've been told to kind of trust Han's instincts on people, but you know, there's other things. We're not really set on how everything is about to go. They give the data cube to the engineer. She says she's going to make sure everything on it checks out, but gives them time to get cleaned up, get fresh clothes, get some sleep, get some food, and get a tour of the ship, which Han's really excited about because, of course, he wants to see the cockpit and see, you know, how flying works. Just as a fun connection note, the type of ship this pleasure yacht is, it's made by, or it is a Nubian ship. Nubian is the same kind of ship that you see the Royal Starship in Phantom Menace. That ship is a Nubian. That always confused me as a kid, because I always thought Nubian was like Naboo-ian, and like that was who made the ships, but it's actually not. And maybe that was something that got changed over time, but it's not from Naboo, but it's made by the same people that make the ships for Naboo. But that sleek design that gets described is that kind of connection to ships that we've seen before in the films. So that's just kind of a neat tidbit. But that's actually all I really have to say this week. I know this is kind of a shorter video than I usually do on these books, and I'm sorry for that. It's not that these chapters were great, it's just that they were very action-packed, and there's a little bit less to pull out of that into a larger discussion, but it certainly was a joy to read. I love reading Han knowing how to bank turns and do all of his cool stuff, and I love seeing them interact. And of course, right now, a lot of this is just mysterious. Now, we only have a couple of more chapters left. We're going to be starting on chapter 17. This only goes to chapter 22. So we are definitely really close to being done with the book itself. So all is going to be revealed here very soon. But that's really what I have to say this week. Next week, we're going to read chapters 17 and 18 and discuss that. But please leave me a comment letting me know what you thought of the book so far, these chapters that we read. If you're not already, follow us on all the socials, and I will talk to you guys next week.